2 months to live. That's what the doctor had told Albert Henderson 3 weeks ago, and every day since then had felt like borrowed time. At 84, Albert had lived through wars, recessions, the loss of parents and friends. But nothing had prepared him for the devastating reality of leaving behind Betty, his wife of 67 years, his partner in everything, his reason for waking up every morning. They were sitting in the Las Vegas International Hotel, waiting for Elvis to take the stage, when Albert felt another wave of pain shoot through his abdomen. The pancreatic cancer was aggressive and unforgiving, but Albert was determined not to let it steal this moment from them. This concert represented something sacred. It was their annual pilgrimage, their tradition that had started in 1957 when they were young and full of dreams, believing they had forever stretching out before them. Now Albert knew that forever had an expiration date, and it was approaching faster than either of them was ready to accept. As Elvis appeared on stage in his rhinestone jumpsuit, Albert made a decision that would either give them one last perfect memory or break both their hearts in front of 15,000 strangers. But to understand why this particular concert would become the most important moment of their 67-year love story, you need to know about the letter Albert had written to Betty that morning, a letter she wasn't supposed to read until after he was gone. It was November 15, 1975, at the Las Vegas International Hotel. The showroom was packed with 15,000 fans who had come from around the world to see the king of rock and roll perform. But in the third row, center section, sat two people for whom this concert meant something deeper than entertainment. Albert Henderson, 84 years old, adjusted his vintage bow tie, the same one he had worn to their wedding in 1957, while fighting waves of pain that threatened to double him over. The pancreatic cancer was like a clock ticking inside his body, counting down the precious hours he had left with the woman sitting beside him. Betty Henderson, 82 years old, wore the blue dress that Albert had bought her for their 60th wedding anniversary, her silver hair styled in the same elegant updo she had worn to every Elvis concert for the past 18 years. She was humming along to the pre-show music, completely unaware that this would be their final performance together, that the man who had loved her since she was 15 years old was carrying a secret that would change everything. Patricia Martinez had delivered the diagnosis with the gentle professionalism that doctors reserve for the worst possible news. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable. Aggressive. 2 months if he was lucky, maybe 3 with aggressive pain management. The numbers had hit Albert like physical blows, but what devastated him most was the doctor's next question. Would you like me to speak with your wife about your prognosis? But 3 weeks had passed, and Albert still hadn't found the words to destroy the woman he loved more than life itself. The journey to this moment had begun 68 years earlier, in the summer of 1954, when 17-year-old Albert Henderson first laid eyes on 15-year-old Betty Williams at a church social in Memphis, Tennessee. Albert had been the shy son of a cotton farmer, Betty the preacher's daughter, with eyes that sparkled like stars, and a laugh that could make flowers bloom. When That's All Right came cracking through the church radio, one of Elvis's first recordings, Albert had worked up the courage to ask Betty to dance. I don't really know how, Albert had stammered, his face burning with embarrassment. Neither do I, Betty had replied with a smile that changed Albert's life forever. I guess we'll figure it out together. They had danced awkwardly in the church basement, stepping on each other's toes and laughing at their mistakes, while Elvis Presley's revolutionary new sound provided the soundtrack to their first moment together. From that night forward, Elvis's music became the thread that wove through every chapter of their love story. Albert proposed to Betty in 1956, on the night Elvis performed on The Ed Sullivan Show. They had watched the performance together in Albert's family's living room, and when Elvis sang Love Me Tender, Albert dropped to one knee and pulled out his grandmother's engagement ring. Betty Williams, he had said, his voice shaking with emotion, will you love me tender for the rest of our lives? Their wedding in June 1957 was a simple affair in the same church where they had first danced. As they exchanged vows, the organist played a soft instrumental version of Love Me Tender, and Albert whispered to Betty, this is our song now. No matter what happens, whenever we hear Elvis sing, we'll remember this moment. The early years of their marriage had been filled with the usual struggles of young couples in the 1950s. Albert worked double shifts at the cotton mill to support them, while Betty took in sewing to help make ends meet. But every Friday night they would dance in their tiny kitchen to Elvis records, forgetting their troubles for a few precious moments as they held each other close and dreamed of better days ahead. When Elvis was drafted into the Army in 1958, Albert and Betty followed his story with the devotion of family members. When he returned from Germany in 1960, they celebrated as if their own son had come home from war. As Elvis's career evolved through the 1960s, so did their own lives. 3 children were born. Albert built a successful construction business, and Betty became a beloved elementary school teacher who was known for incorporating Elvis songs into her lessons about American culture. But it was in 1973, when Elvis began his Las Vegas residency, that Albert and Betty discovered their greatest shared passion. Albert had saved up for months to surprise Betty with tickets to see Elvis perform at the International Hotel for their 16th wedding anniversary. The moment Elvis walked onto that stage in his white jumpsuit, both Albert and Betty knew they were witnessing something magical. "He'll always have it," Albert had replied, squeezing his wife's hand. "Some things are just eternal." From that night forward, Albert and Betty made an annual pilgrimage to Las Vegas to see Elvis perform. It became their most cherished tradition, a time when they could reconnect with each other and with the music that had shaped their love story. They would save up all year, book the same hotel room, and always request seats in the 3rd row if possible, because Betty said it was close enough to see the sweat on Elvis's brow, but far enough away to see the magic of the entire performance. Now, on what Albert knew would be their final trip together, he was struggling to find a way to make this night perfect without revealing why it had to be perfect. The letter he had written that morning was hidden in his jacket pocket, a final love letter that contained everything he had never found the words to say in 67 years of marriage. "My dearest Betty," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. But please know that I have never left your side. Every breath I ever took was sweeter because I shared the air with you. Every song we ever danced to is still playing in whatever realm I now inhabit." The letter went on for 3 pages, chronicling their life together through the lens of Elvis's music. How "Love Me Tender" had been their wedding song, how "Can't Help Falling in Love" had played in the hospital when each of their children was born, how "The Wonder of You" had carried them through difficult times when Albert's business struggled and money was tight. As Elvis took the stage to thunderous applause, Albert felt the weight of that letter against his chest like a physical ache. The performer looked magnificent in his white rhinestone jumpsuit, every inch the king at the height of his powers, but Albert barely saw him. All Albert could see was Betty's face, glowing with the same excitement she had shown at every concert for the past 18 years, completely unaware that this joy would soon be replaced by devastating grief. Elvis opened with "C.C. Rider," his voice strong and confident as he worked the crowd into a frenzy. Albert watched Betty sing along to every word, her hands moving in time with the music, her body swaying with the same rhythm that had captivated him when they first danced together as teenagers. How could he possibly tell this woman that their forever was about to end? The pain in Albert's abdomen flared again, sharp and unforgiving, but he fought to keep his expression neutral. He had become expert at hiding his suffering over the past 3 weeks, timing his pain medication carefully so that Betty wouldn't notice his discomfort. The doctor had warned him that the pain would get worse, that eventually it would become impossible to hide, but Albert was determined to make it through this one last evening without casting a shadow over Betty's happiness. Elvis transitioned into "Burning Love," and the energy in the room reached fever pitch. Betty was clapping along enthusiastically, and Albert forced himself to smile and participate, even though every movement sent waves of agony through his body. This was what he had come for, to see Betty happy one more time, to give her one final perfect memory that she could hold on to when the difficult days ahead arrived. But as Elvis moved into the gentler portion of his set, Albert felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. When the opening notes of "Love Me Tender" filled the showroom, Albert's eyes filled with tears that he couldn't control. This song had been the soundtrack to their entire life together, and hearing it now felt like a preview of his own funeral. Betty noticed his tears immediately. "Albert? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Albert wiped his eyes quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing, honey. It's just, this song always gets to me. It reminds me of how lucky I've been to have you in my life." Betty reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with love. We've been lucky to have each other. 67 years and I still get butterflies when you look at me like that." The simple sweetness of her words almost broke Albert's heart completely. How was he supposed to tell this woman that their 67 years together were about to become a memory? How could he destroy her happiness with the truth about his condition? As Elvis continued singing "Love Me Tender," Albert made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood up slowly, fighting through the pain, and extended his hand to Betty. "Would you like to dance with me, Mrs. Henderson?" Betty looked around the packed showroom, suddenly self-conscious. "Here, in front of all these people. We danced to this song in a church basement when we were teenagers," Albert said softly. "We danced to it at our wedding. We've danced to it in our kitchen 1,000 times over 67 years. Why should tonight be any different?" Something in Albert's voice, a note of urgency perhaps, or desperate love, made Betty abandon her hesitation. She took his hand and stood up, and there in the third row of the Las Vegas International Hotel, surrounded by 15,000 strangers, Albert and Betty Henderson began to dance to the song that had defined their love story. At first, the people around them seemed annoyed by the distraction, but as other audience members noticed the elderly couple swaying together with obvious devotion, the mood in the room began to shift. There was something sacred about watching two people who had clearly loved each other for a lifetime sharing what appeared to be a deeply meaningful moment. Elvis himself noticed the dancing couple and was visibly moved by what he saw. He had performed for millions of fans over the years, but there was something special about these two elderly people who were so lost in each other that they seemed unaware of the crowd around them. Elvis made a decision that would make this performance unforgettable for everyone present. The audience fell completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Here was Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer in the world, serenading an elderly couple who represented everything beautiful about lasting love. "How long have you two been married?" Elvis asked gently as the song came to an end. 67 years. Albert replied, his arms still around Betty's waist. Elvis smiled with genuine warmth. 67 years. That's a beautiful thing. What's your secret? Albert looked at Betty, and for a moment his facade almost cracked. "We promised to love each other tender," he said finally, "and we kept that promise through everything life threw at us. Would you mind if I dedicated the next song to you?" Elvis asked. "I'd like everyone here to know that they're in the presence of true love." Before Albert could respond, Elvis returned to the stage and picked up his acoustic guitar. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "I want you to meet Albert and Betty Henderson. They've been married for 67 years, and they just reminded me what this next song is really about." Elvis began playing "Can't Help Falling in Love," but he sang it differently than Albert had ever heard it before. There was a tenderness in his voice, a reverence that transformed the familiar song into something almost sacred. As Elvis sang, Albert felt the weight of everything he was about to lose. The woman in his arms, the life they had built together, the simple joy of holding her hand while listening to the music they both loved. Betty was crying now, overwhelmed by the attention and the beauty of the moment. "Albert, this is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to us." Albert pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, memorizing the feel of her body against his. "You're the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me," he whispered in her ear. "Every day for 67 years. As the song ended, the entire audience rose in a standing ovation. But they weren't just applauding Elvis. They were celebrating Albert and Betty, two people who had shown them what real love looked like. Elvis approached them again, this time carrying something that made Albert's heart stop. A red rose from one of the stage arrangements. "This is for you, man," Elvis said to Betty, handing her the flower. From one romantic to another, "You two have something special. Something that most people spend their whole lives looking for but never find." Betty accepted the rose with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Elvis. This is the most perfect night of our lives." Albert felt his own tears starting again. But this time they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. Somehow, without knowing about Albert's condition, Elvis had given them exactly what Albert had hoped for. One perfect final memory that would sustain Betty through the difficult times ahead. But Elvis wasn't finished. "Would you mind if I asked you something?" He said to Albert, "What's the most important thing you've learned in 67 years of marriage?" Albert considered the question carefully, aware that 15,000 people were waiting for his answer, but more importantly, aware that this might be his last chance to tell Betty something essential about their life together. "The most important thing," Albert said slowly, "is that love isn't just about the big moments, the weddings, the anniversaries, the celebrations. It's about choosing each other every single day, even when it's difficult, even when you're tired, even when you think you can't go on. It's about finding ways to say 'I love you' without words, and about knowing that the person beside you will always be there, no matter what. And it's about understanding that sometimes loving someone means protecting them from pain, even when that protection costs you everything." Betty looked at Albert with confusion, as if she sensed some deeper meaning in his words that she couldn't quite grasp. But before she could ask what he meant, Elvis was speaking again. "That's beautiful," Elvis said. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all learned something important tonight about what real love looks like." As Elvis returned to complete his performance, Albert and Betty made their way back to their seats, but the rest of the concert passed in a blur for Albert. He was consumed with the knowledge that this perfect evening was ending, that tomorrow he would have to find a way to tell Betty about his diagnosis, that their story was entering its final chapter. "Albert, that was magical. I can't believe Elvis dedicated a song to us. I can't believe we danced in front of all those people. This has been the most wonderful night of our entire lives." Albert squeezed her hand gently. "It has been wonderful. You looked beautiful up there, Betty. You've looked beautiful every day for 67 years. That night, as Betty slept peacefully beside him, Albert lay awake thinking about the letter in his jacket pocket. He had planned to give it to her tonight, to finally tell her about his condition. But the evening had been so perfect that he couldn't bring himself to destroy her happiness. Maybe tomorrow, he thought. Maybe he would find the right words tomorrow. But tomorrow brought its own challenge. Albert woke up feeling weaker than he had in weeks, and the pain in his abdomen was becoming harder to hide. Betty noticed his discomfort during breakfast. "Albert, you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired from last night," Albert lied. It was a lot of excitement for an old man. Betty studied his face with the intuition that comes from 67 years of marriage. "You've been looking tired a lot lately. Maybe you should see Dr. Patterson when we get home." He couldn't keep hiding this much longer, and he couldn't bear the thought of Betty finding out about his condition from anyone other than himself. That afternoon, as they sat on their hotel balcony looking out at the Las Vegas skyline, Albert finally found the courage to speak. "Betty, I need to tell you something important." She turned to him with immediate concern. "What is it, sweetheart?" Albert reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter he had written that morning. "I wrote this for you, but I think it's better if I tell you in person." Betty's face went pale as she saw the serious expression on Albert's face. "Albert, you're scaring me. 3 weeks ago I went to see Dr. Martinez about the stomach pain I've been having." Albert's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "She ran some tests, and the results weren't what we hoped for." Betty's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What kind of results?" "I have pancreatic cancer, Betty. It's advanced and it's aggressive. Dr. Martinez says I have maybe 2 months, possibly 3 with treatment." The silence that followed was the longest of Albert's life. Betty stared at him with an expression of complete disbelief, as if he had just told her that the sun was going to stop rising. "No," she said finally. "No, that's not possible. You're fine. You were dancing last night. You're fine." Albert reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Betty, I know this is shocking. Shocking." Betty's voice cracked. "Albert, this isn't shocking. This is impossible. We have plans. We have Christmas with the grandchildren. We have our 70th wedding anniversary to celebrate. We have..." Her voice trailed off as the reality began to sink in. Albert watched as his wife's face crumpled with the weight of understanding, and he felt his own heart breaking as he witnessed her world falling apart. "Why didn't you tell me?" Betty whispered. "Why didn't you tell me 3 weeks ago?" Albert moved closer to her, and this time she didn't pull away. "Because I wanted to give you last night. I wanted you to have one more perfect memory before everything changed." Betty looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "Last night? That's why you wanted to dance? That's why you were crying during Love Me Tender? You were saying goodbye?" "Tazra trying to," Albert admitted. "But I realized that I don't know how to say goodbye to you, Betty. I don't know how to let go of 67 years of love." Betty was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond the city. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than Albert had expected. "Then don't say goodbye," she said. "Don't you dare say goodbye to me, Albert Henderson. We're going to fight this thing together. Just like we've fought everything else together for 67 years. Albert felt a surge of love so powerful it almost knocked him over. "Betty, the doctor said—" "I don't care what the doctor said," Betty interrupted. "They don't know you like I know you. They don't know how stubborn you are, how strong you are, how much you have to live for. We're going to get a second opinion, and a third opinion, and a fourth opinion if we have to." Albert wanted to tell her that he had already gotten second and third opinions, that the diagnosis was unanimous, that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. But looking at his wife's determined face, he realized that hope was the only luxury they could afford. If Betty needed to fight, then he would fight with her, even if the battle was already lost. Over the next 6 weeks, Betty threw herself into researching Albert's condition with the same dedication she had once brought to lesson planning. She contacted specialists across the country, researched experimental treatments, and even looked into clinical trials. Albert went along with every appointment, every test, every consultation, because he couldn't bear to crush Betty's determination. The news was always the same. The cancer was too advanced, too aggressive, too widespread. But Betty refused to accept defeat, and Albert found himself drawing strength from her refusal to give up. During this time, their relationship deepened in ways Albert hadn't thought possible after 67 years together. They talked about things they had never discussed: their fears, their regrets, their dreams for whatever time they had left. Betty began sleeping curled up against Albert's side, as if she could protect him from the disease by keeping him close. One evening in early December, as Albert was reading the newspaper and Betty was working on a crossword puzzle, she looked up suddenly. "Albert, do you remember what Elvis said that night? About love being a choice you make every day?" "I remember. I choose you for whatever time we have left." Albert set down his newspaper and looked at his wife with wonder. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Betty replied. 67 years ago, we found something that most people never find, and cancer doesn't get to take that away from us." As December progressed, Albert's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly. The pain became harder to manage, and he lost weight despite Betty's efforts to keep him eating. But their love seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, as if they were both determined to pack a lifetime of devotion into whatever time remained. On December 20th, exactly 1 month after their Las Vegas trip, Albert collapsed in their kitchen while Betty was making breakfast. The ambulance rushed him to the hospital, where Dr. Martinez delivered the news they had been dreading. Albert's time was measured in days, not weeks. Betty never left his bedside. She brought their old record player to the hospital and played Elvis songs softly while Albert drifted in and out of consciousness. She told him stories about their life together, reminded him of their happiest moments, and promised him that she would be strong enough to carry their love forward into whatever came next. On December 23rd, as snow began to fall outside the hospital window, Albert opened his eyes and looked at Betty with perfect clarity. "Betty, my darling," he whispered. "Thank you for choosing me every day for 67 years. Thank you for giving me something worth choosing," Betty replied, holding his hand against her cheek. Albert smiled with the last of his strength. "When you hear Elvis sing, remember that I'm dancing with you. Every time you hear 'Love Me Tender,' know that I'm still loving you tender. And I always will be." His last words were the same words he had spoken to her 67 years earlier. "I love you, Betty Williams." The funeral was held on December 28th, and Elvis Presley himself sent flowers with a note that read, "To Betty, Albert showed me what real love looks like. May you find comfort in knowing that some love stories are so beautiful they become eternal." Betty lived for 14 more years, and every Christmas Eve she would play "Love Me Tender" and dance alone in her living room, feeling Albert's presence as clearly as if he were still holding her in his arm. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had already found her forever love, and forever didn't end just because one person left the dance floor first. When Betty died in 1989, she was buried beside Albert, and their shared headstone bore a simple inscription: "Albert and Betty Henderson, married June 15, 1957. Loving each other tender for eternity." The story of Albert and Betty Henderson became legendary among Elvis fans and was often told as an example of how music can serve as the soundtrack to real love. Their final dance in the Las Vegas showroom was remembered by many who witnessed it as one of the most beautiful moments they had ever seen. Proof that some love stories are so powerful they transform everyone who encounters them. In 1980, 5 years after Albert's death, Elvis Presley died at Graceland. Betty was among the thousands of mourners who gathered to pay their respects, and she brought with her the red rose that Elvis had given her that night in Las Vegas. She placed it on his grave with a note that read, "Thank you for giving us one perfect last dance. Albert says hello from heaven." The love story of Albert and Betty Henderson serves as a reminder that true love isn't measured by the number of years you have together, but by the depth of devotion you maintain during those years. Their story proves that some promises, like the promise to love someone tender, are so sacred that they transcend death itself, becoming part of the eternal soundtrack of human connection and hope. Today, when couples attend Elvis tribute concerts in Las Vegas, they sometimes hear the story of the elderly couple who danced in the third row and received a personal serenade from the king. The story is told as a reminder that love like Albert and Betty's is rare and precious, and that sometimes the most important dances happen when we know they might be our last. The International Hotel, now known as the Westgate Las Vegas, has preserved the memory of that magical night in November 9. There is a small plaque in the showroom that reads, "In memory of Albert and Betty Henderson, who showed us that true love dances eternal." November 5. Every year on that date, the hotel plays Love Me Tender at the exact time Elvis sang it for them, and staff members report that sometimes in the third row center section, you can see the faint outline of two figures swaying together in perfect harmony. The red rose that Elvis gave to Betty that night was preserved by her children after her death, pressed between the pages of the family Bible alongside the love letter Albert had written on their final morning together. The letter, which Betty never needed to read because their love proved stronger than any goodbye, has become a treasured family heirloom that reminds each new generation that some promises are so sacred they echo through eternity. Patricia Martinez, who delivered Albert's diagnosis, later became an advocate for family-centered end-of-life care. She often tells the story of Albert and Betty Henderson in her medical lectures as an example of how love can transform even the most difficult circumstance. "Albert taught me that sometimes the most important medicine we can prescribe is time to love, time to dance, time to create memories that will sustain those we leave behind," she explains to her students. The Elvis tribute artist who performed that night, Johnny Rivers, continued his career for another 30 years. But he always said that the night he sang for Albert and Betty Henderson was the most important performance of his life. "I thought I was just an impersonator," he later reflected. "But that night I realized I was serving as a bridge between people and the music that defined their lives." Albert and Betty didn't see an impersonator on that stage. They saw Elvis himself, blessing their loves. In 1982, 7 years after Albert's death, Betty was invited to speak at a conference about grief and healing. Her speech, titled "Dancing Alone But Never Lonely," became one of the most requested presentations in the counseling community. Betty spoke about how Albert's love continued to sustain her even after his death, how she could still feel his presence when she played their favorite Elvis songs, and how their final dance in Las Vegas had become a source of strength during her darkest moments. "People ask me how I survived losing the love of my life," Betty would tell audiences. "The answer is that I didn't lose him. Albert taught me that love doesn't end when life ends. It just changes form. Every time I hear 'Love Me Tender,' Albert is still dancing with me. Every time I see an elderly couple holding hands, Albert is reminding me that what we had was real and lasting and beautiful." Betty's grandchildren grew up hearing stories about their grandfather's courage and their grandmother's strength, and many of them chose careers in healthcare or counseling, inspired by the example of love and resilience their grandparents had provided. The family tradition of attending Elvis concerts continues to this day, with third and fourth generation Henderson family members making annual pilgrimages to Las Vegas to honor Albert and Betty's memory. The love story of Albert and Betty Henderson has been featured in numerous books about enduring love, and their final dance has been recreated in documentaries about Elvis Presley's impact on American culture. But perhaps the most lasting tribute to their love is the way their story continues to inspire couples facing their own challenges. Marriage counselors often share Albert and Betty's example with clients who are struggling. using their story to illustrate that love is indeed a choice made fresh each day, and that choosing love in difficult circumstances can create something transcendent and beautiful. In 2017, 42 years after Albert's death, the city of Memphis erected a small memorial in the park where Albert and Betty had their first official date. The memorial features a bench facing a small fountain, with a plaque that reads, "For Albert and Betty Henderson, who proved that some love stories are so beautiful they become eternal songs." Visitors often report seeing elderly couples sitting on the bench, holding hands and listening to Elvis music on portable radios, as if Albert and Betty's love continues to inspire new chapters in other people's stories. The final testament to their extraordinary love came in 2019 when Betty's great-granddaughter, also named Betty, got married on June 15th, the same date as Albert and Betty's wedding 62 years earlier. The young couple's first dance was to "Love Me Tender," and family members swear they could feel Albert and Betty's presence in the room, blessing this new beginning with the same love that had sustained them through 67 years of marriage and beyond. Albert Henderson died believing he was leaving Betty behind, but their story proves that some loves are so profound they transcend the boundaries between life and death. Every time "Love Me Tender" plays somewhere in the world, Albert and Betty Henderson are still dancing together, still proving that true love really can be eternal, and still reminding all of us that the most beautiful dances happen when two hearts beat as one, whether for 67 years or for all eternity.